from contexts with very different understandings of what these objects were actually about. And in this class, we'll explore how particular historical contexts give rise to certain kinds of art. And we'll see how intimately the beliefs and structures of societies are linked with the images that they make for themselves. We'll see that not all kinds of images are possible at all times and under all cultural conditions. What is achievable, desirable, or even allowed is directly associated with the broader features of a society as a whole. Even though works of art are as diverse and disparate as the societies that they come from, among all those differences, though, we still have to recognize that there are some common features that run throughout all of those contexts. I think you get some sense of that by looking at the group of cave paintings I'm showing you on the screen. Although these were made thousands of miles and thousands of years from one another, we see an underlying visual image in common, the form of the human hand standing out against a background. Despite all of the ways in which these places and times are unlike each other in their geology, climate, beliefs, social structure, technologies that are available, the people who make these marks arrived at a common way of expressing themselves. But eventually, people seek to represent things from the world around them, to represent them as images. Something enormously complicated needs to happen. The world of 3D things has to be accommodated to the 2D surface that is available to the maker. Objects become pictures, and pictures require things like composition, color, scale, perspective, and they require physical skill and mental capacities to make this translation. And these categories are still the way that we talk about visual images, giving us a language for communicating to one another what we're actually looking at. Here, in the Megaloceros Gallery in Chauvet Cave in France, we can see the complexities are growing. Here we have not just a single figure or even a group of figures, but an entire scene. That means understanding how to depict relationships among different forms and the space that they occupy together. It also means understanding the role of time. Are we looking at many creatures at once or the same creature at different moments? I called this a scene, but could we also call it a story? Does it offer us a sequence of events unfolding in time? How we choose to answer these questions relates to ways in which the maker or the artist has chosen to show us the scene. About 32,000 years later, and halfway around the world, a different artist took on this same subject, and the results couldn't be more different. Jackson Pollock, the famous abstract artist, described it in this way. Quote, "It was a stampede of every animal in the American West, cows and horses and antelopes and buffaloes. Everything is charging across that surface." End quote. It might be very difficult for us to see what he's talking about, in part because the picture is so abstract. While there are some suggestions in the painting of this theme, pointed forms that look like the head of a cow, for instance, for the most part, Pollock is not working to show the world as we see it. What he's interested in achieving, something we'll talk about in detail towards the end of the course, is very different from what the prehistoric person making cave art is after. The tools that are available have changed, and so have the forms through which the artist expresses himself. This work means stampede in the context of Pollock's culture of mid-20th century America. So even if it is at some level describing the same phenomenon as his counterpart in the cave, the language in which he does so is specific and unique. In other words, it's all about context. Sometimes it's most difficult for us to discern the nature of this context of our own culture because we're on the inside of it. But our art context is very specific too. The idea that the main purpose of art is to provide an opportunity to experience beauty is actually a pretty recent one. When we view a painting like Monet's in an art museum, we encounter it as an aesthetic object. It invites us to contemplate the extraordinary colors and forms of his garden, but it doesn't serve any practical or utilitarian function. It doesn't do anything other than to provide that experience. Because we're so accustomed to seeing art in this way, we tend to forget that until the last few hundred years, in the European tradition at least, things that we now regard as art were highly functional. If you were to encounter this painting by one of the greatest artists of the Italian Renaissance, Mantegna, in an art history textbook, you might conclude that it is meant to operate in the same way as that Monet painting, as a way of enticing you to experience the work aesthetically. But here is the painting in its full context. It's part of a huge altarpiece, and it would have been one part of this elaborate ensemble that was the focus of the interior of a church. Seeing it in this way, in its full context, reminds us that while achieving a beautiful representation of the Virgin Mary and Christ was important, it was never an end in itself. This beauty could be a way for viewers to understand the liturgy, the religious ceremony unfolding in front of them, and to recognize the story of Christ's life and its moral lessons. The question of context, then, is going to be central to this class, and we'll constantly be asking questions about the context in which we see a work of art, the context in which it originally served, and why the difference between those two things might be important. This is especially true when we are exploring artworks that do not come from the European context. Very often, the contexts have been obliterated by the introduction of objects into collections and museums. The object I'm showing you here is seen against a blank white background, which is how we might encounter it in a case in a museum. But it was almost certainly placed in a tomb in ancient Egypt, where it performed a very specific function. It was what we call apotropaic, or protective. It warded off evil forces. It's made out of the ivory of a hippopotamus, whose sharp tusks would have provided very real protection in life, too. It's carved in extraordinary ways with figures of animals and personages important in this process of protecting the dead in their lives in the next world. The irony that this wand, this magical device, could not protect itself from archaeologists is a rich irony. The reason we encounter the object is because it has been removed from its original context. Our knowledge comes at the expense of the integrity of that context. We can't know this object if it is still intuned, if it is still functioning in the way in which it was originally intended. This course is going to cover a lot of ground, from the ancient Mediterranean to present-day North America. So let me say right at the start that we're not going to explore this entire history of world art in 12 weeks. As you can imagine, figuring out what to include in a class like this is pretty daunting. So I and my colleagues have taken this as a challenge, and we've selected a group of 11 works of art, buildings, sculptures, paintings, manuscripts, that come from vastly different times and places. Because nobody can be an expert in the whole history of art, we've decided to take a team approach to teaching this class. You'll be hearing lecturers this term from 3 professors in the art history department, and our respective expertise in different periods of art history allows you to hear from experts talking about the things that they know best and that they're most passionate about. Let me throw it over to two of my colleagues to introduce themselves.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sungjung Kim, one of the instructors for this Art History 101 course you're about to take. My specialty in art history goes all the way back to the ancient world, and in particular, the Mediterranean area known as the classical world, namely Greece and Rome. Very shortly, you'll be plunged into this world starting next week, where you'll encounter masterpieces from over 2,000 years ago that have, as you will see, a direct bearing on the visual culture and art of our times. Using the loaded term classical to refer to the culture of antiquity, that is specifically Greek and Roman, not only applies the importance of those traditions and the effect that they had on our present world, but it also tends to marginalize other ancient cultures beyond Greece and Rome. But as long as we're cognizant of the multitude of traditions that shaped our world today, we can then hop right into the incredibly rich foundations of Western art, and where we'll be exploring the basic tenets of Western architecture and the art of sculpting in the next 2 weeks. So, how do we know so much about the visual cultures that are so far removed from us? The answer to this question is also the reason why I ended up doing what I do, which is archaeology. And here is a picture from when I led a team of U of T undergraduates to excavate near the legendary city of Thebes in Greece in 2016. What's so remarkable about the classical world is that we have so much literature from that period that is handed down to us in textual form. But equally important, if not more so, is what allows us to directly encounter the material culture from that period. These might be flashy stuff like the remains of a temple, or a fancy sculpture of the mythical hero, such as Heracles, as you see here in a most recent example of a discovery in 2022 in a Greek town called Philippi. Or it could be a portrait of a historically significant individual, such as a Roman emperor. But they can also simply be the pots and pans, loom weights, and other household goods that normal people used on a daily basis, which can tell us so much about their lives, habits, and thoughts. And the moment we come into contact with that unearthed physical object that hasn't been touched in 2,500 years, I can assure you that the thrill is very palpable. And it is what got me hooked as a student excavating in Sicily for the first time in my life to dedicate the rest to the pursuit of discovering our past. By way of introduction to the journey you're about to take, I'd like to present to you one of my absolute favorite pieces from the Hellenistic world, namely the period of Greece after the Eastern conquest of Alexander the Great that opened up immense possibilities in terms of artistic styles due to the myriad of cultural and artistic traditions that could be accessed. This is the time when the strict codification of the perfect, idealized beauty of a youthful citizen and heroic body breaks down to encompass representations of the so called other. And this is the old, the ugly, the destitute, the sensuous, the barbaric, and the like. The glorification of a half man, half beast, such as this satyr, fits squarely into that pattern of exploring the so called other, as we see in this exceptionally beautiful Barberini faun, a 2nd century BCE marble original. This satyr has fallen asleep in a drunken stupor, befitting his Dionysiac nature. The rocky outcrop and panther skin on which he reclines give further context to his affinity with nature. The satyr's rampant sexuality is implied by his posture, which is both relaxed and tense at the same time and shows a kind of curated abandon. The anthropomorphic tendency is notable here because it beckons us to relish in its sensuality without having to negotiate its animal otherness, since, were it not for the discreetly tucked away tail that's visible through the crack, we wouldn't even know that this was the mythical beast and follower of Dionysus. What I want to bring to your attention with this piece is the curious inversion of the gendered viewing practice that's been articulated by scholars during the second wave feminism. Basically, that men do the looking and women are always being looked at. The motif of the sexualized sleeping figure is something that had been around before, as we see here on a Greek vase decorated with a satyr approaching a sleeping Maenad. But this over life size statue, offering a blatantly sexualized body of a male figure for viewing pleasure, turns this tradition on its head. And I leave it up to you to imagine what I was feeling when I encountered the statue firsthand as an eager student of classical archaeology. The close up of the face reveals that he's probably dreaming, something of an erotic nature, perhaps. And by the way, why is he sleeping? Well, sleeping figures, if you think about it, provides an opportunity to linger your gaze without much threat on this otherwise dangerous creature of the wild. Art is everywhere, and the visual capacity of humanity is what defines us to a large extent. And to study the history of art and visual culture is to learn about what makes us aesthetic creatures as opposed to purely functional beings. I am really excited that you've decided to embark on this journey with us, and I wish you the best of luck with the rest of the semester.
Hello, I'm Professor Adam Cohen, and you've just heard from my colleague, Professor Sungjung Kim, talk about the ancient world of Greece and Rome. And very shortly, you're about to hear from another colleague, Professor Jordan Baer, who will pick up the story that we're sketching out today of the history of art by talking about the modern world. And so it's left to me as the middle leg of this three-legged race to somehow bridge the ancient world and the modern world. And fortunately, my own specialty is the art and architecture of the Middle Ages, which is exactly that period in between. And so I'm happy to share a few words that will just give you a sense of how it is I came to this particular slice of the historical pie and how it might fit in with the rest of the story that you're hearing. The term Middle Ages was actually coined by thinkers in the period we call the Renaissance, when in Italy in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, the artists and tastemakers were trying to distinguish themselves from what came before, right? And Renaissance, literally rebirth, what is it that they were rebirthing? That was the world of classical antiquity to some degree, right? And so they had the classics of Greece and Rome. Then there was all this stuff that came in between, and then themselves in Florence and Siena and Rome, Milan, and they called themselves the rebirth of classical antiquity. And everything else was in the middle. And I have to confess that when I first was introduced to the history of art in my first university course, I looked at some of these art objects from the Renaissance and the period just beyond it, which often gets termed Baroque, but now we just call all of it early modern. In any event, an artist like Gian Lorenzo Bernini sculpted a a marble work that told one of the stories from the classical ancient mythology. Pluto, the god of the underworld, abducting Proserpina and dragging her off to the underworld, where he wanted to make her his wife. Now, as it happens, Proserpina was already married, and this was not a good thing. But let me leave the details of the story aside for a moment and just focus on how here we see in the slide that you're looking at Bernini's 17th century sculpture and a Roman funeral sarcophagus that shows a version of the same story. So we can see very clearly Bernini, 17th century, early modern, late Renaissance, Baroque, whatever term you want to put on it, picking up a story from Roman antiquity and giving it his own twist. And twist is just the right word, because in his stylistic vision, the abduction was a very physical activity that required the twisting and the turning of the protagonists, of Pluto and Proserpina, or in the original Greek, Persephone. And there's a detail to Bernini's sculpture that just made me gasp when I saw it. Pluto's hand pressing into Proserpina's thigh. Now, of course, if one stops to think about what is actually being depicted, it's quite horrible. But what astonished me at the time was the incredible way that Bernini was able to turn marble into what looked like real flesh. That the softness and the pressure and just every muscle, the verisimilitude, the way that he could create that lifelike quality just blew me away. And really, from that moment, I was hooked. Like, how could a human being create something so remarkable? Now, as I continued to learn about other periods in art history, I found that I was actually drawn to works from a different period, the preceding Middle Ages, in which the values of rendering things in what we loosely call a naturalistic or perhaps optically correct manner would be a better way to put it. These were not the values of medieval art, right? And so here, for example, are two facing pages of an illuminated manuscript, a decorated book from just after the year 1000. This was the book that I wrote my dissertation on and published as my first scholarly book. And it is a very far cry in many ways from what we see in the Bernini sculpture. It's flat, it's abstract, there are elements that we can recognize. In the central medallion on the left is the hand of God. On the right-hand page is, in the central medallion, image of the Virgin Mary with her son, Jesus, sitting on her lap. And then just below that is a picture of the woman who was responsible for the making of this book, a nun, actually the abbess of the nunnery. Her name is Uta. Codex is just the fancy word for book, right? So it's Uta's book, and there she is giving it to the Virgin and Child. So it's an act of piety and devotion and her religious desire to connect with the Virgin and Child. Two other pictures from the book show one of the central images from the Christian religion, a version of the crucifixion in which Jesus is hanging from the cross. But if you look carefully, you'll see that his eyes are open, he is wearing clothes, he doesn't seem to be particularly suffering, and it is a picture that tries to communicate something of the difficult theological issues and what it means to be a God who dies on the cross, but is human, but is also divine at the same time. And this page, in a way, is one of many philosophical ways of working through some of these difficult theological problems. And then finally, on the last page, is a saint who was of particular importance to Uta's nunnery. Erhard was the patron saint of their nunnery, and he's in the act of performing the Mass, which is a ritual that enables people in the congregation to participate in the body and the blood of Jesus and to literally connect physically with God through the ingestion of the wine and the bread, the wafer of the Eucharist. Now, these are all difficult terms, especially if you don't come from a Christian background, as I myself do not. But I found beautiful works like this. Look at all that gold, after all, which shows that Uta has a lot of money at her disposal. Books like this encapsulate an entire worldview. The Middle Ages is often called the Age of Faith, and certainly there are issues of faith communicated in these pictures. And to me, looking especially at books has always been very exciting, because one gets the sense of holding the very same object that people 1,000 years ago held in their hands and interacted with in some of the same ways that I still can today. Of course, they lived in very different society with very different background, but it's that process of connecting with objects from the past, whether they're illuminated manuscripts from the Middle Ages or anything else, whether they're Christian, whether they're is from the Islamic world, they're Hebrew manuscripts, or whether they're beyond the Middle Ages, going back to the Renaissance and the Baroque and early modern period. For me, the exciting thing is to explore the many ways that these works of art encapsulate ideas from their own particular societies, things that I can try and understand and think about the ways that they are meaningful in either a positive or negative way. And we hope that these are the kinds of things that we can help teach you in the course of FAH 101.
Hi, everyone. It's me again. I'm running the third leg of this. Let me give you an example of one fascinating photographer, a man who took pictures for the tabloid press in New York and who adopted the pseudonym of Ouija. He did this so that he could conjure up the idea of the Ouija board, that popular game for contacting the spirit world and predicting the future. So to emphasize his apparently psychic ability to predict where grisly stories of murder and mayhem would unfold, and to be there in time to make photographs of them. His photos are often very brutal, showing the harsh realities of life in a major metropolis. They're also supremely ironic. Here he juxtaposes the dead body with the title of the film on the theater marquee, The Joy of Living. Now, taking a ghastly picture of a corpse lying in the street might not strike us as capable of being a work of art. And it's certainly different from the great masterpieces of the classical, medieval, or Renaissance worlds. But it is a quintessentially modern kind of image, one that's part of a strong tradition. Look at this lithograph made in 1834 by the Parisian artist Daumier. It depicts an incident during an uprising when the government troops opened fire on a group of civilians in an apartment building. It's a brutal picture, certainly, but no more brutal than the act that it represents. And it has the virtue of showing things without pulling any punches. The details of disorder, that head propped unceremoniously against the bed, the streaks of blood, the pillow just about to fall onto the floor, all of those are part of a tradition of realism stretching back centuries. My favorite Ouija photo, however, is this one, since I think it tells us a great deal about its moment and about our own. It depicts another scene of human carnage, this time a man who is drowned and been dragged out of the ocean at the beach at Coney Island. Rescuers are laboring to resuscitate him. The focus of their efforts and of the composition of the scene are on him. But one member of the crowd thinks otherwise. A woman amidst the group looks up and sees Ouija, the cameraman. She recognizes that this is a moment that will be captured and printed in the newspaper. And so she does what we have all been conditioned to do in this moment of self-consciousness, when we know we are about to be made into a picture, and she smiles. We can see in another great work of modern art, Benjamin West's Death of General Wolfe, the nobility of death and of the people who attend it. In the case of Ouija's picture, though, death is grotesque and ludicrous and a little bit amusing. It's something that I think in our moment of narcissism, when we photograph ourselves all the time, remains quite relevant. We're a very long way from the masterpieces of the classical world here, but there's nevertheless this fundamental link between the beliefs and practices of a specific moment in time and the representations that it produces about itself. The three of us have worked together to select the works of art that we'll be exploring in this course. And among our criteria in choosing these were first that they illuminate big questions or themes that are important to art history in the particular language of that work of art's cultural moment. And secondly, that they provide opportunities for us to learn certain kinds of skills that are important to understanding and appreciating art. I want to take you now on a preview journey through the 11 weeks ahead and the works of art that we'll be exploring together. We'll begin with the Parthenon in ancient Greece, dedicated to the goddess Athena and considered the high point of Greek art and architecture. It's also a symbol of Western civilization itself, and particularly of democracy, the form of government under which this structure emerged. It's also a site where historical change has inscribed itself. From its original purpose, it subsequently became a Christian church and then an Islamic mosque, and finally, today, a tourist attraction for secular global culture. It also appears almost everywhere we look, sometimes as a direct copy, as in Asheville, Tennessee, which now houses an art museum, sometimes in parts, as in the colonnaded columns of Union Station, inspired by classical architecture. For your first writing assignment, you'll be heading out into the city to encounter some of these enduring legacies of the Parthenon with which we are all surrounded. To talk about how buildings work, we need to learn to talk about how they're made, what their structure is. The tool that we have for doing this is the architectural plan, and you'll learn in this course how to decipher these representations. From Greece, we move maybe predictably to ancient Rome. And the object that we're discussing as representative of that civilization is something called the Gemma Augustea. It's an engraved gem that depicts gods and heroes from the ancient world, as well as actual people who existed historically. So, the emperor, for instance. And this object allows us to talk about the enduring genre of portraiture. We'll talk about what makes a good portrait, whether it has to resemble or look like the person that it's depicting. And we'll also talk about the strange situation in this object that it shows portraits of mythological figures, figures who were not historical. What kind of imagination is required in order to produce an image of a god? Because we're trying to give a sense of the breadth of artistic production across the globe, we then jump from the ancient Mediterranean to ancient China. And of course, needless to say, it's impossible to select one work of art that stands for any of these cultures, but we've chosen ones that we think are representative and interesting enough to stand for some of the larger ambitions of these cultures. In the case of China, we've focused on the terracotta warriors of Xi'an. They depict the army of the first Chinese emperor and their funerary art. They were meant to accompany and protect the emperor in the afterlife, and so they were buried with him. They're sculptures. They depict warriors, but also horses and chariots, and their sizes are dictated by rank, so the most senior generals loom the largest. Looking at these objects is a chance for us to encounter sculpture, a medium that is fundamentally concerned with three-dimensional forms. In the 7th century, a new faith emerges, that of Islam. It is exemplified here in the Great Mosque of Damascus in modern Syria. It's one of the oldest and largest mosques in the world. It's also unusual in that it retains most of its original architectural features from the 8th century. This building allows us to think about how space becomes sacred and how architecture accommodates itself to the requirements and beliefs of the religion that it houses. We move from the enormous scale of the mosque to something incredibly tiny, that is a book of hours or prayer book that was produced for a French queen called Jeanne d'Evreux in the Middle Ages. It's an illuminated manuscript, so it's a painting miniaturized into the size of a book. And what we can see in examining this object is, of course, how central Christianity was to life in medieval Europe, but also the splendor and luxury of the objects produced for elites like queens. It's also a combination of text and image. It's an illustrated book. And so we'll have a chance to think about how those two kinds of language, verbal and visual, interact with one another, and what that interaction means for the specific religious contexts of medieval Christianity. From that tiny expression of medieval Christianity, we move to the largest church in the world, St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Considered a high point of Italian Renaissance, this structure was designed by a number of important architects, including Michelangelo and Bernini. St. Peter's is probably the most renowned work in Italian Renaissance architecture. And we'll see in looking at this structure, again, just how form can respond to the requirements of ritual and how architectural style becomes an important way of understanding the relationship between the built material world and the spiritual world with which it connects. From a world in which religion plays a central role in almost every facet of life, we will move into the modern period. And one of the important constituents of the modern world is a turn towards secular subjects. And in particular, in the case of one of the great movements in painting, Impressionism, it's a turn to everyday life as subject matter. This is the picture that gave Impressionism its name. It's made by Claude Monet in 1872. And you can tell right away that it's not a picture about kings and queens. It's not a scene of religion or from mythology. It's a painting that reflects the experience of Monet's presence in a port city as the sun is slowly rising. In other words, it's a picture about everyday experience as filtered through the sensibility of the modern artist. This shift reflects an enormous change in European civilization, and it's one that tells us a great deal about the world as it was developing in the 19th century, and ultimately the world that we find ourselves living in today. Around the turn of the 20th century, another tremendous change shakes European painting, and that is the turn to abstraction. Abstraction describes a mode of representation that doesn't resemble or refer to the way things appear in our empirical experience of the world. One of the most famous and perhaps infamous movements within abstraction is Cubism, pioneered by, among others, Pablo Picasso, whose Demoiselle d'Avignon we see here. We'll talk about what abstraction means in relation to the full arc of the history of art. How radical a change is it? And does it mean abandoning all of the ties to the works of the past? Or is it better understood as an outcome of those processes and conventions? In the realm of architecture, too, the modern period ushers in some remarkable changes. It's hard to imagine a building that looks more different from, say, the Parthenon than the structure that you see on the screen here. This is Frank Lloyd Wright's infamous Guggenheim Museum building, completed in 1959 in New York City. At the time, it was almost universally reviled. Critics, and you'll read some of them, launched protests against the building. Over time, though, the view has changed, and it's now considered one of the most important structures of modern architecture anywhere in the world. It also gives us the opportunity to talk about the kind of building that this is. It's a museum, and museums are the place in our culture where we most frequently encounter works of art. And we'll want to discuss how it is that the museum as an institution helps not only to enable this encounter, but also determines many of the terms on which we see and experience works of art. Finally, we'll move to North America, and in particular, contemporary Canada, to look at the work of an Indigenous artist who practiced right up till the year of his passing in 2017. The artist is Bo Dick, and he was someone who merged the craftsmanship and artistry associated with traditional Indigenous mask making with a unique sensibility about the contemporary world and the role of Western influences. not only on indigenous art making, but on indigenous life. The masks are also simultaneously ceremonial and aesthetic. They're both useful in ceremonies as well as being objects to be collected and contemplated aesthetically. This is a work that weaves together many of the different strands that we will examine in the course. It is a work that is both traditional and contemporary. It is functional, but also beautiful. In your first tutorial sessions this week, you'll take a very informal first try at the most fundamental skill in the discipline of art history, and that is learning to describe in words what you see when you look at a work of art. You can think of this as the basic unit of art history that all other kinds of more advanced understanding have to begin with. Some of this process will come naturally to some of us. Other parts will require learning particular ways of looking and special vocabulary for communicating. I like to think that this is one of the things that actually makes art history a profoundly important and useful field of study right now. It might not be immediately apparent how art history will equip you for the future. Certainly not in the obvious ways that a course in business or engineering or biology might. But here's why I think it does. Art history gives us the tools to translate our subjective experience into something that can be shared and communicated with other people. It allows us to talk about something that we see and feel in tangible terms. And in a society